Hello friends, I just finished up these two books and I'm about to start two new ones, and I figured now would be the perfect time to discuss some of the books I've read over the past few months, but that I haven't mentioned on the channel yet. Over the summer, I've been quite an efficient and voracious reader, and with that, I've had some books that have been delightful, others surprising, and then there's been some that have been quite disappointing, that have dropped the ball for me. So with all that said, I got a stack of books beside me. Let's talk about them. All right, let's get a negative one out of the way. Many of you will remember, if you watch my vlog reading Maxim Gorky, that at the end of the video, I mentioned I was going to start reading The Tin Drum by Günter Grass. And I was really excited about this book because one of you recommended it to me months ago. I found it at a bookstore in Sheridan, Wyoming, and it's been sitting on my shelf. And I was just excited to read it. So I actually started reading this and vlogging it, I want to say about a month ago, maybe a little bit more than that. I went on a camping trip with a good friend of mine to the Grand Tetons, and I was reading this while I was camping out there, and it disappointed. It just disappointed to me. At first, I was wondering if it's because I was traveling that things felt a bit disconnected and quite strange, and that I felt quite disoriented reading the book. Because the narrator of the story is this character, Oscar, who's quite an unreliable narrator, often referring to himself from third person, then back into first person. And that threw me off for the first 100 pages before I got my bearings underneath me. But then the story quickly just became this laborious fever dream of strange, quirky, and just odd events that had very loose connections between them. And 400 or 500 pages into this book, I found myself utterly uninterested. Every time picking up this book felt like a chore. It felt like I was just trudging through snow trying to get from one chapter to the next. And it's not just a matter of boredom, because I'm not someone to just quit on a book quickly because it's boring and DNF it. But the story just felt like an over-bloated, fictionalized biography. The characters felt so undeveloped that 400 or 500 pages in, characters would die or pass away or tragic things would happen. I just wouldn't care. And it's not from a lack of trying. It's just the characters were not developed to an extent where you felt attached, where you felt the trauma and the emotion of the character. It just wasn't there. And I kept, as I was reading it, I was like, I mean, the book is well written. It's artistic. It's poetic at times. The language is quite beautiful. There are things in the book that work. I like the duality and contrast between Goethe and Rasputin that goes on in this book. There's a lot of symbolism and allegories going on with the pounding of the tin drum and different aspects of Oscar imagines himself, or he is kind of stunted growth at a young age, and all these other aspects, the colors of Poland and matching the red and white of his drum, all of that. So you don't need to explain that to me in the comments. But the book just didn't work for me. And as I was looking at some other reviews on Goodreads, it seemed like the reasons that it didn't work for me was the same reasons it didn't work for other people. It just wasn't clicking. So for that reason, this book just let me down, unfortunately. Perhaps I'll return to it in the future, but honestly, I really doubt it, just because there's moments that perhaps with greater context under Polish and German history of the city of Danzig, the comedy and the satire would land a bit better. But even beyond that, the story just didn't work for me. It just did not work on multiple levels, and it just felt, like I said, a chore to read this book. So unfortunately, this book, The Tin Drum, did disappoint. Now, to switch gears to a book that surprised me was The Painted Bird by Jerzy Kosinski. This book I mentioned I had already started reading when I bought it back in Tennessee. On the flight back, I started reading this, and I knew going into it that it was a disturbing book to some extent. I don't remember whether I saw it on a YouTube video or an Instagram post, but someone had referenced it as being quite obscene. And obscene and vulgar and disturbing it is. With that said, though, it's riveting in some way. It's gripping. It's striking. Perhaps because every single chapter seems to contain some more extreme instance of sexual abuse or violence than the last chapter. Perhaps that continual heightening of the book and of the story just draws you in. It's kind of like your inability to look away from a car crash. But at the same time, the narrative is quite fascinating. You're looking at the story, you're told it through the eyes of this young boy, and I think because of his naivety and ill-formed worldview, as he's kind of experiencing all these incredibly traumatic and emotionally disturbing events, he's kind of emotionally numbed by it. His world, as he understands it, is being formed in real time, and as readers you become slowly emotionally numb to it by the end of the story too. Like the shock value almost gets beaten out of you by the end of the story, no matter how just grotesque and obscene the scenes are. So with that said, there are plenty of trigger warnings, and again, to briefly summarize the story because I didn't really introduce it, you're following a young gypsy or Jewish boy who has been stranded in the midst of World War II, and he's wandering from one abusive home to the other in Eastern Europe, generally in the Poland region. So very interesting book. Because I enjoyed it so much and it was so, I felt visually compelling, especially in the war depictions. I would like to read more of Kosinski's work down the line. Another book that unfortunately disappointed that will likely get me in some hot water is Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. I really wanted to like this book, and I'm still excited to read Jane Eyre and Agnes Grey from the other Brontë sisters, but this book just did not land for me at all. I think the biggest issue with the book, to me, is the multi-layered narrative. Why on earth is 90% of the story told through the second-person narration from the servant to a guest? It just seems like an awful choice. Perhaps you could argue a reason here or there, but for me, it just disconnected me from the story and the narrative that was going on. On top of that, all of the characters, for the most part, are these just irrational, erratic, vindictive, and abusive or toxic, as a common word nowadays, characters. Now, I understand how a book can use these deplorable or monstrosity type of characters, monstrous characters, to depict something, to exemplify something, to move along a plot. I don't need every character to be affable and friendly or lovable in that manner. But to me, just the plot is just was way too exhaustive. It was laborsome to read. I felt like it was just being dragged out. Now, there are some things that did work well in the novel. I think the setting choice and depiction worked very well. The Moors and how it made the story feel very suffocating to be in this particular setting for the whole story, back and forth between these two estates. And I think it gave that ominous and dark and stormy feeling to it. And the other component as well that I think worked is the complex psychology of these characters, where they are more focused on being vile and seeking revenge upon each other rather than doing what's maybe the more emotionally responsible or rational thing to do. But overall, the story just felt laborsome. It did not feel like a must-read classic, and it is one I'm open to return to in the future. But to me, it just felt shapeless and felt flat. Now, switching back over to books that did impress me is The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea by Yukio Mishima. I mentioned when I got this book that I had listened to a 3 or 4 hour podcast about Mishima, his life, key moments and influences not upon his life but also upon his writing, and his kind of general worldview or philosophy that he embedded in his works. And this book definitely gave me a good glimpse of his not just appreciation, but his longing for the aesthetics, his longing for glory and romanticism. He was very much an appreciator of the Greeks and those plays that had tragedy and that had these ostentatious, or not just ostentatious, but these very obvious heroic characters of an Odysseus, of an Achilles, that might have had a tragic fate, but they had a beautiful death. And you see a lot of that embedded in the story of Noboru and his kind of fatherly figure that comes into his life, this local sailor Ryuji, who, as he's gotten older, he's kind of fallen out of love with the sea and the adventure side of him. And he resigns himself to the expectations of society. He gives up on these unrealized ambitions for glory and heroicism. While Noboru he still idealizes the sea. He still has this idea of kind of rejecting modernity or rejecting society, and still has this longing for the heroes that he and his gang of friends believe in. So he views Ryuji, this decision by Ryuji, as treasonous, as a traitor, and it's beautifully written. The poetic prose and the style and the metaphors, I think that, of course, it's coming over in translation, but that Mishima has in this work it's incredible. It's a really short read as well, and I'll have to probably discuss it in an upcoming haul. But I did pick up a collection of Mishima. It's got 3 of his stories, one of these being in there. So a little bit of an overlap there, but I am excited to read more of Mishima in 2025. But this book did live up to the hype, fortunately. And another book that surprised me, that I had a whole vlog on, so you can check it out, is My Childhood, or Детство by Maxim Gorky. And I didn't really know what to expect with this book. I picked it up mainly because it looked very old and rare at the shop in Nashville, Tennessee, and I was looking to find more of these obscure or lesser-known Russian writers, Gorky being one of them. And I picked it up and decided to read it sooner rather than later, and it really surprised me because as an autobiographical work, I thought it would be quite ho-hum or monotonous or even dry at certain spots, but it really wasn't. It really had these different components or characters that felt larger than life, that felt like they were, in a way, they would resemble people that you could imagine in your own life, or he would speak in particulars that felt universal to not only all the Russian people, but to all people in general, even today. And I think you get a lot of this in all autobiographical works, where you can really jump into the person's worldview and life experiences and gather a lot of information and perspectives and insights from that. But you also get this idea of how similar we all are, even if the instance is very idiosyncratic to them or particular to them. It does have this universal component to it. So really enjoyed it so much I bought the 3rd book in this trilogy of autobiographical works from Gorky. So now I'm hunting for the 2nd one. But that one definitely impressed me. Another book that has a lot of hype around it, or it's starting to get more hype. It's kind of tethered together, at least I've seen it tethered together on Instagram a bit, to Stoner by John Williams, is Hard Rain Falling by Don Carpenter. This one from New York Review of Books is a phenomenal book. I don't think I quite gave it 5 stars on Goodreads, and those are always, rating scales are always weird. But this book is phenomenal. I gave a written review on my Substack, so that will be a lot more precise in my feelings and analysis of this book. But overall, it is a hard-nosed, hitting, emotionally, just a gut-punched kind of book. You primarily follow this character, Jack Levitt, who is this recalcitrant youth who is just quite cantankerous overall, and he's going to these different pool halls. He's struggling with poverty, and specifically, he's struggling to control the vagaries of life. These different instances of misfortune keep coming to him, and he wants to just punch back. He wants to just kind of use his rage and this kind of brawler type of personality to it. But over time, his worldview starts to deepen and widen, especially as he meets Billy. He spends time in prison and experiences moments of abuse and just the world kind of bearing down on him. It's quite an enlightening and thrilling story. I felt like not only were the characters very visceral and gripping, but specifically there's a lot of deep philosophical reflections that occur through both the dialogue and like the inner monologue of the characters within the story. So it is very raw. It feels very poignant at times as well. And it's one I definitely need to return to. The more I think about it, the more I just want to kind of grab at it again and give it a reread. So maybe later next year I'll read over different passages again. But highly recommend Hard Rain Falling. This lived up to the hype when I had it recommended to me. Now, another book that was quite interesting because it didn't disappoint, but it didn't quite impress either, is Great Fear on the Mountain by Charles Ferdinand Ramuz. I think I'm pronouncing that right. But I got this book because I am a subscriber over at Archipelago Books. They do a lot of interesting publications of works that are either rarely translated or never previously translated authors beyond the Anglosphere. This one being translated from French. And has a very interesting premise. Essentially, you're following this little village of people, a little Swiss village, and they haven't gone up to this high alpine pasture in years, in a few generations, because the last time things went haywire, people died, it was awful, and that's all you really remember. But as generations go by, the youth don't remember this. They hear these vague, kind of mythical type stories from their grandparents, and they don't really believe it. And I believe they are in need of food, or they're just looking for more resources. And the youth have the idea of let's have a vote and let's go back up to that area. So they do, and in general, the concept's pretty interesting, right? Like returning to this supernatural or mysterious region of land, right? Up on the mountain, like what could happen? Something terrible happened there last time. It feels like the setting of some kind of, horror film. But then I felt like the story just fell flat. And I wonder how much of that is just I was traveling when I read this, or how some of that is perhaps translation, or just symbolism within the depictions of nature that just don't land for me. But the characters are pretty interesting. You have this kind of venomous character, or at least he's kind of depicted in that way, of Clow. But beyond that, once you get halfway in the story and you actually get to them kind of setting up shop basically on the pasture, the plot just moves very slow. It's very dry. It's a lot of long descriptive language that it's not overly beautifully written in a way that it's like, okay, it's monotonous, but it makes up for it in the way that it is very poetic and metaphoric and elaborately described, unlike a book I'll get to a little bit later in this video. But it just felt flat. It felt like a wasted opportunity with the plot in this book. There wasn't like this big climactic moment where the mysterious or occult forces were acting upon the people. Is very, very slow build without any kind of point off the cliff that you got to. Basically, it just felt like a slow burn with no with no reward at the end, basically. So this book was interesting. Perhaps some of you, maybe you've read it, maybe you've read other works from him, but I'd be fascinated to hear your thoughts if you did read this, if you liked it, why or why not. And lastly, we got to talk about a DNF. And God, not a DNF I wanted to. I wanted to like this book so bad. I wanted to like this book so bad, and I requested this book from the publisher because I felt like it was a perfect fit for me. I was going to love it. It was compared to other authors and works I loved, and I was expecting it to deliver, but it did not at all. And that is The Instructions by Adam Levin. He was compared to, and I think it's even blurbed on some of the books, he's compared to David Foster Wallace. He's supposed to kind of be this, at least he was proclaimed to be this prodigy, basically in the way that he's describing stuff, that it's a humorous work, it's expansive, it's all these things. And I think there are some creative and experimental components to it, but this was just Levin bloviating on and on and on. I mean, just any thought he had, just pouring it on the paper, just vomiting ideas onto the page over and over. Now, there's parts that are okay. There's some creative and funny components to the characters, how you're getting this narrative from elementary school children, and some of the characters are quite zany, or they do odd things, or some of the ideas like the penny gun is quite a fascinating invention. But oh my God, I had to DNF this book around page 300. I mean, oh my God. I kept waiting for there to be some kind of point being made, for some dots to be connected, for some kind of linguistic talent to shine through, for some kind of philosophical point being made. For example, you can make a fair argument that Infinite Jest needs to be edited down. There's plenty of sections and chapters that can just be, cut right out, and you're not diminishing the story. But at least when Wallace goes on these garrulous monologues, he's at least getting to something. Perhaps he goes longer than he needs to, but there is a point being made at the end of the day. in this book, it felt like there was no point being made at the end of the day. It just felt like garrulous garbage, to be quite frank. And I feel like I feel wrong to be that vehement and vituperative with my language about this book, but it just, oh my god, again, I wanted to like it. I gave it the benefit of the doubt, but it was not good. It just was not good at all. It did not live up to the expectations set forth from it. I probably will give it another chance and come back to it later. Oh my god. Reading some of the 5-star reviews of this book on Goodreads, I was like, what are you reading that I'm not reading? I don't know. I don't know. I think I've spent enough time blabbering myself about this book. I'm disappointed. Now let's get to the 2 books I just finished reading. The first of which being The House of Government by Yuri Slezkine. And this is a historical, autobiographical, and a bit of fictional, which I'll get to in a moment, retelling or depiction of the Russian Revolution, primarily the period of 1917, the October Revolution, the February Revolution, where the Bolsheviks are taking over, and the early formative years of the Soviet Union, leading all the way up to World War I. So it kind of ends right around the beginning of the Second World War, and it begins really in like the 1890s. He discusses the kind of what would you call it, the fomenting that was going on within the country and the culture that led to the Bolshevik Revolution, the end of the Tsarist regime, all of that. Slezkine is a phenomenal storyteller. Specifically, what he does chronologically and what he does with specific quotes or excerpts makes the story just move at a very engaging pace, and also allows you to kind of see from all angles. There's a lot of zooming in and zooming out going on, so to speak. So, for example, he used a lot of different excerpts and quotes from memoirs and interviews and different books that have been published into this work, where you're getting the real and natural voice of these different characters, translated of course, but you're getting actual quotes and things that were being said, thought, and written at the time. And as I mentioned, you're going back and forth chronologically, where he will make a connection to some specific cult or religion that formed, let's say, in more modern day, and how that relates to this fervent Marxism and religious fanaticism going on within the communist regime and their ideologies. And then there's a lot of this zooming in and out going on, where you're focusing in on specific characters or specific families, then you're zooming back out to see the culture or the Soviet people as a whole, and that way you're getting the particular, you're getting the individual experience, but you're also getting the general experience as well. So it's very great at doing this micro and macro thing, macro and micro thing back and forth throughout the story. It does also a great job at not being too exhaustive on one point. There is one caveat to that, but I'd say the pace of it works really well, where you get enough to kind of satiate your curiosity about Golodomor, and the famine and starvation and essentially kind of genocide of the Ukrainian people following the civil war within Russia, and this whole push for collectivization, or whether it's the revolution itself, or whether it's the Great Purge that happened later. The story does a great job of giving you enough information where it is extensive and detailed, but it's not to the point where you're like, I get it. I didn't need this much information on this specific thing. He doesn't say stuck on a point. To put it precisely there. The only caveat there is I felt like the last 200 pages, maybe 3, were a little bit too exhaustive on this whole arresting thing, which is a key point of history. The Great Purge, the arresting, the political oppression and suppression, and just drastic violence and aggression by Stalin and the Soviet Union Party upon its own people, its own officials during the Great Purge, is an incredibly important moment that deserves to be a big chunk of the book. But I felt like the way that it was described, just this family after this family after this family got arrested, and maybe it's supposed to kind of just relay how severe it was. I get that. But it just felt like I felt like we were just droning on and on about this. So and so was an official and arrested these families. Then that official got arrested, and then that got arrested, and they got sentenced. And it just felt a little bit repetitive. Perhaps it could have just used a little bit more back and forth with other events that were occurring at the period. But that would be my only really critique. Other than that, really enjoyed this book, especially with my current but emerging fascination with Russian language, culture, all of that. And it gave me the exact kind of context and information I needed to read some of those early Soviet works that I have on my shelf, like Red Cavalry, like The 12 Chairs, and some of the New York Review of Books I just got sent about the Civil War period as well. Envy by Yuri Alesha. It gives me the right context to understand what was going on with those books of the Foundation Pit as well. So really enjoyed this work. I definitely plan to read more historical works. I just picked up A People's Tragedy, that historical historical work as well. So I'll probably be reading that in the new year. And the other book I'm almost done with. I have about 50 pages, so I can't give final thoughts. But that is Blinding by Mircea Cărtărescu. And for those of you that have followed the channel for a while, you know Solenoid by Cărtărescu was, and it still is, the favorite book I've ever read. It is phenomenal. I'll definitely give it more praise at the end of this year when I talk about best books I read this year. But I have a 50-minute video on it. I think it is a book that I read more precisely and intensely and deeply into than any other book. I think I gave it quite a vivid and accurate analysis, more than I have any other book. I just connected with it so well, and I thought it was so phantasmagoric, so magical, so incredibly creative and captivating, and just encompassing, that I had so many high hopes for this book. It's been out of print for years now. I believe it was last in print in maybe 2020, 2022, something like that. It was first published, I think, in 2015, and it just kept selling out. Finally, I got my hands on it, and it's not disappointed. It's probably even more of what makes Cărtărescu special, but also to a point of his own demise. I'll get to what I mean in a moment. There's a lot of ideas in this that are much more fleshed out in Solenoid. There's a lot of autobiographical instances of his own life that he's fictionalizing in here, or certain ideas, philosophical questions that are like sprinkled in here that are more expounded upon in Solenoid. This book feels a little too uncontained. It feels like Cărtărescu ran a bit wild with this one. It is vomit-inducing imagery. It is kaleidoscopic to a point where it is, to say it's a fever dream of a book is probably understating it. It is so phantasmagoric. It is so pyrotechnical that there are points where you kind of forget where you're at when you're reading this book. Some books you have to chew gum and walk, so to speak, right? You got to hold an idea as you're reading like a long sentence and understand what's being, mentioned later, or draw dots later in the book. This book, as I described it to my wife, you have to chew bubblegum, bounce a basketball, walk, and read this book at the same time. Like there's some passages that are so visually extravagant, so exhaustive in description, so odd and peculiar, that you really do have to kind of read the beginning of the passage again just to remember where the hell are we? Who is describing this? What's going on? There's so much. There's a bit back and forth chronologically as well. But at the same time, there's beautiful questions. There's beautiful passages. Even the parts that I feel like are quite a little too verbose, a little too much. Cărtărescu is doing a little too much, basically. Even in those sections, they're beautifully written. This is an example of someone who can take the quotidian, can take the monotonous, the banal, and make it incredibly fascinating. This guy could write about going to your mailbox or getting groceries at Kroger, and he could make it this incredible novel. He has that kind of talent. But I feel like this was a little bit a little bit too unrestrained. It needed to be contained and corralled in a bit more. So far, I still have a little bit left to read, and I will likely read it again because I don't feel like I've read this close enough as I would like to make a full review or video on it. And I think there's more here. And unfortunately, this is only part 1 of 3 of this Orbitor trilogy that has yet to be fully translated into English. But those are just at least my first impressions, is that it is a kaleidoscopic fever dream image bomb, basically, that you are in for. You're in a tornado of metaphors, allegories, symbolism, and adjectives, basically. But you love it. I'm like happily lost in this book, but I am lost a bit. So it's very fascinating. I still would recommend getting it. I love Cărtărescu's work, but this one it didn't match Solenoid for me, at least not yet. But I will have to come back to it. Now, to end off this video, after all that rambling, if you're still around here, the 2 books I plan to start soon is, I mean, what would I do other than, after finishing a 1,000-page historical work, then start a 1,600-page novel, Demons by Hamito van Droder. I actually saw the older, I think it's pronounced Knopf. You guys can correct me in the comments, but Knopf edition of this, the 2-volume edition that you can kind of find on stores. But this is from Wise Blood Publishing. This is a book I got about 2 months ago, and it's been a little bit intimidating to look at it. But it is 2-volume set. This is volume 1 I'm holding here. 1,600 pages following what is presumably another absurd and wild story. A labyrinthine plot, primarily centered in the life of Vienna. So I'm very intrigued to see how this is. I damn well hope it's good, because the instructions, a 2-volume, 1,000-page book, that ended up being a DNF. So I hope that this 2-volume, 1,600 pages is not a DNF, and is more a joy and a pleasure and a wild ride to read. So I hope that that's the case. And the other book I'm starting that I just got yesterday that releases, it's probably released, it's out by the time you watch this video, but it's a brand new early release from New York Review of Books, and that is Waiting for the Fear by, I believe it's pronounced Oguz Atay, a Turkish writer, so I need to work on my pronunciation there. But a Turkish writer. This is a collection of short stories from Atay, who has been rarely translated into English, and I'm really interested to read these stories just because they're supposedly full of oddities and absurdities. So I'm expecting something Kafkaesque. I'm expecting something strange, but compelling just the same, I guess. So I don't have anything to say about the story yet because I obviously haven't read it, but it's a short guy right here, just I think just over 200 pages. Yes, 205 pages. So I'm going to be reading this. I'll probably finish it within the week, and I'll be working on this guy for quite a while. So with all that said, let me know in the comments down below, what books did I really get wrong that you think I need to give another shot, or what books did you experience the same kind of frustration or the same kind of euphoria with that I was describing? I'd love to hear your thoughts on any of these books down in the comments below. As always, like the video, subscribe for more content like this, and I'll see you all in the next one.